This video was brought to you by the generosity of my supporters on Ko-fi. Thank you for supporting the channel. Hello, my lovelies. My name's Gilbert Dolthalion, and the plan for today is to make a doublet to go along with my pride trunk hose. Because what's a pair of trunk hose without a doublet? If you want to see my trunk hose, the video is linked up here and down below, but you don't need to have watched that to watch this. Just know that they were fabulous, and I need something equally fabulous to go with them. Now, a bit of prefacing for this video. I'm going to be using queer as an umbrella term for LGBT+ people and experiences quite a lot. I know that in some places it was, and still is, used as a slur, but we have been using it to describe ourselves since the 80s, and I do think that it's one of the best umbrella terms that we have for ourselves. I've linked a video down below that goes into a deep dive of the use of the word queer, but I'm not going to cover it all here because, well, that's a 40-minute video and this is meant to be a sewing video and not a video essay. With that out of the way, here's a problem for you. What do you match with rainbow aside from more rainbow? I spent a lot of time looking for a nice rainbow fabric that might match my trunk hose before I decided that I was looking at it the wrong way. Why match? And why not do something a bit more personal? And that's how I hit on doing the colours of the genderqueer flag. A lot of you watching might recognise them as being very similar to the colours of the suffragette flag, especially when represented in fabric where some of the colour choices aren't as precise as they could be. And that would just be a cool coincidence if it wasn't for certain people using the suffragette flag for a banner of hate. But that's also a rant for another day. I wanted to do something that's a little more interesting than plain block colours though, and after some poking around I picked out some stripy green dirndl fabric, which led to me thinking about combining chevrons and stripes, and then I was hooked. As usual, I'm using the Tudor Tailor pattern for this, although as you'll see I didn't actually end up following the pattern because I like to make life more difficult for myself than it needs to be. After all, I'd already set myself the challenge of chevrons, so why not make life harder for myself? And if you want to see how I went about enlarging that pattern and making it fit me, there's a video detailing my experiences with doing that and doing the mock-up, and you can find that up here and down below as well. So armed with a plan and a pattern, there wasn't much to do except for get started. Well, I did need to make one tiny change to the pattern, so let's have a look at that first. Because I'm going for that two-tone chevron thing on the doublet on the front of it, I need to re-pattern this to get that pattern piece to do the top and the bottom row of it, and also for the back piece as well. Sleeves are fine because the sleeves are going to be one colour, but this needs to be redone. So I have figured out where I need it to split and made myself a line. The pattern for the bottom half is easy because I would just fold it on that line and use that as the pattern piece, but because I need to pattern match, I want to do it slightly differently. So that is the pattern for my bottom half, and that is the pattern piece for my top half. And I've done it out of tracing paper so that I can then trace the lines of the pattern onto it so I can pattern match. So to do that, all I did was trace the pattern piece onto my tracing paper and cut it out. I have added the seam allowance. I haven't got the full seam allowance on this one because I ran out of space on the width of my tracing paper, but I've put a note on it so I remember to add it on. And then I need to do the same for the back as well. With my pattern piece prepared, I placed it on the fabric how I wanted it and pinned it down, and then copied out part of the pattern before cutting it out. This means that I have a record of exactly where the pattern was matched up to when I unpin it. I shamelessly stole this technique from Jalea, who used it in her Cruella dress, so go watch that for a more detailed explanation. And once it's cut out, I turn the pattern piece over and match those lines up to the fabric so I can find a piece that matches perfectly. I did have to redraw the pattern on the reverse side to make it a bit more visible, but a little bit of extra work is worth it to make the pattern matching process a lot easier. So these are the other half of the front pieces. of the doublet. Obviously they will need to have stripes added, that is the next stage, but I just wanted to show that this is the front piece and it still has the pattern piece, because the folded down bit didn't get in the way of the pattern. This piece I had to do by doing the straight lines, which are easy, especially on this one where it's got a right angle at the bottom and then another straight line on the top. And then I did the curve once I had all the other three sides in place by flipping the pattern piece back up so I could get to that curve and copy it. So it's been drawn directly onto the fabric with that one. But now that all of my pattern pieces are ready to go, I can cut them out. Once all my pattern pieces were cut out, it was time to start preparing stripes for the lavender half of the doublet. I've covered making bias binding before, so I'm not going to cover it again in detail here. These technically are just binding strips rather than being bias binding, as they're cut on the straight grain, which is what allowed me to rip them rather than cutting them, which was incredibly useful as I ended up needing a lot of them. The next part is what I will describe as stripe hell, aka matching up far too many stripes. I wanted to mark them to the darker green stripes on the top half, so to start out, I pinned the top half to the bottom and marked where the stripes hit the purple fabric. Then it was a case of pinning each stripe down and using a ruler to keep them straight the whole length of the stripe. The back panels were actually a lot easier because I could use the straight back seam as a reference to get the first stripe straight and measure all of the others out from there. With the front two panels, I had to do the first one by eye, and then to make sure that both sides would match, not just mark the stripes in from the top panel, but on the second one also reference the already pinned stripes on the first half. It was a pain, and it took a while. Of course, just pinning them was only part of the story. They also needed to be sewn onto the fabric, which didn't take as long, but still seemed like forever. If anything's made me want to lose weight recently, this is it. If I ever do this again, I can only hope that it will be with less stripes. They were sewn down with a straight stitch as close to the edge as I could manage. My machine has a setting that puts the needle to one side, which I use for anything where I'm trying to stitch as close to a line as I can. And while you watch that, please excuse this quick ad break. With the vertical stripes done, I added one horizontal one at the join just to represent the flag a little clearer and help mask any fudges in the join a little better. 10 out of 10, can totally recommend this fudge, it made life so much easier later. I unfolded one side and pinned it right to the edge of the seam allowance, and then pinned the folded side down based on that, and sewed those in place as well. Of course, the sleeves also had to be striped. I started by folding the top half of the sleeve in half, and by that point I knew that each stripe was about 3.5 centimeters apart, so I used that as a guide. Since the top half had 2 stripes by the seams on the wrist seam, I then used that to measure out the wrist seam of the bottom half, and then did the rest by eye, keeping them 3.5 centimeters apart again. Many stripes. I initially cut 5 stripes and ended up cutting 17. That's 25.5 meters, and that's also why I decided to make my own binding rather than buying ribbon or something similar. Just under half a meter of fabric versus 25 meters of ribbon, especially when the fabric comes from stash, is a big difference in price. So while I'm sewing these, let me answer something that you might have been wondering for a while. What is genderqueer? It's actually an older term than non-binary, having come into use in the 1990s, and was initially used as an umbrella term for anyone who didn't fall under the 2 binary genders of male and female. Anyone who was queer queering or not conforming to the traditional ideas of gender. To some, it's a slightly more political stance towards gender than non-binary is. With the reclaimed use of queer, non-binary is much more neutral. Genderqueer folk are also much more likely to identify with a binary gender, but not with the social constructs and expectations of it, and to actively push against them. It's been seen as a counterculture as well as a gender identity. But like with a lot of umbrella terms, there's a lot of fuzziness around the edges, and there's no strict measure of this is genderqueer and this is not. That's kind of the point. It's non-conformist by nature. But back to the sewing. After what felt like far too long, I had successfully striped most of my lavender fabric, so it was time to return to the front panels. Since I was joining lavender to green, I set up my sewing machine with a purple top thread and a green bobbin, so that the thread would better match my sewing. It's a little trick that I use a lot when appliquing, or when I just can't be bothered to change my bobbin too much. It did take a little bit of fiddling to get the stripes to match up again, but thanks to that horizontal stripe, it was a lot easier than it could have been. Then I pressed the seams open and zigzagged them to prevent fraying, which is how I finished all of my seams on this. Okay, so now I have my two back pieces complete with all their trim. The two pieces are together. I just need to pattern match. Everyone's favourite bit. Not that I haven't done enough pattern matching already today, but you know. So, luckily these ones are fairly easy to pattern match because the stripes are fairly visible on the reverse side. So I'm going to start from the join, but the most important bits are really getting these stripes lined up. I can just about see them through, which helps too. So I'm going to do it with horizontal pins as well as vertical ones. So horizontal ones over the stripes and then vertical ones between them, and that's to make sure that the stripes stay in the right place. It's also made a little bit more difficult because it is on the bias. That is a diagonal pin. It goes through both, and then a horizontal one in between. And the lavender portions were just pinned together as normal at the seam, checking the bottom edge to make sure the stripes were still parallel to one another. And then I've done two horizontal ones on the midsection because that's too bulky to go horizontal. And again, to keep them in place, but also to remind me to stop there because I'm going to do one half in green and one half in purple. So then that's some successful pattern matching. So, yay. At this stage, I interlined the pieces by sewing a piece of canvas to each body part. I actually regret not doing this before I sewed the green parts to the lavender parts. It would have been better if they were just interlined from the start, especially with the bias cut. But that didn't happen, so it happened here, right before I sewed the body together along the shoulder seams and the side seams. Then I did the same thing with the lining, sewing that up so it was ready to go when I got there. The sleeves are two parts, so they also needed to be sewn together. With two-part sleeves, I like to sew them in two parts as well, sewing the inside curve first because it's easier to press open if I can have it flat. And then the outside curve, and I use a sleeve ham to press it. The outside curve is only sewn down to the opening, so there's space to put in a sleeve fastening when everything is finished. And then I did the sleeve lining in exactly the same way. So this is where we're up to. Stripe hell is almost finished. I've still got to do wings, but aside from that, it's done. The main body is obviously together, and so is the lining. I need to put sleeves in, and then it'll be onto wings and collars and all of that sort of stuff. So, my first thought was to just attach the lining of the main body and treat it as one, because almost all of the edges are going to get something put over the top of them. So, there's the facing on the front pieces, then on the bottom there is the wings, and then obviously the collar as well. But that would mean that there would be a raw seam at the sleeves that I didn't want to deal with. So what I'm actually going to do is sew the sleeves in first. I'm going to attach the lining to the sleeves and treat them as one piece, sew them to the main body, and then whip stitch the lining over the top of it. So I will still be sewing down all of the outside edges along where the facing is going to go, along where the wings are going to go, and on the collar. But I need to put the sleeves in first, but I can't be bothered to take the lining out, so I'm going to be doing it around the lining. But yeah, it's kind of, I feel like doing all of the decoration was the long bit, and it should go fairly quick from here as long as I have time to actually sew, which has been my issue lately.
With that said, the first step was to tack the lining into the main body so there were less pins sitting around, using the largest stitch size possible on my machine. I just sewed the bottom hem and the collar seam and left the sides pinned together so that if I needed to get inside while I was doing the sleeves I could do. I then tacked the sleeve lining into the sleeve as well, making sure to match left to left and right to right, sewing the sleeve side but leaving the wrist hem open. 2 gathering stitches were put in over the head of the sleeve, again using a large stitch and leaving the tails rather than trimming them off so I could pull on them to gather it later. Next is the sleeve wings. I wanted these interlined to make sure they'd sit properly, so the first step was to sew in the interlining. This is technically a top stitch, so for each side I made sure it would be on the underside of the wing, against the sleeve where it can't be seen. It needed to be a top stitch, i.e. visible on the outside, because I cut the interlining without seam allowance to make sure there wasn't any more bulk in the sleeve seam, but the last thing I wanted was it moving around inside the wing once it was sewn into place. With that done, I could fold the wing in half, sandwiching the interlining in the middle, and tack that down so it wouldn't slip while I was sewing it in place. The wings are pinned into place around the sleeve side, avoiding catching the lining like I said. In theory, they should go from point to point around it, so it shouldn't cross over like this, but I think my pattern piece already had seam allowance factored in and I forgot to account for that, so this is an extra long one. And then that was tacked into place as well.
Okay, so this is the wings in, or well, they're tacked in. It's much easier to tack them in before you try and do the sleeves because the sleeves are going to be gathered on the main point where the wings are in. So the sleeves are just going to need a lot more fiddling around, and if the wings are already attached to the main piece, which they're more like a piece of, it's just one less thing to be wrangling while you're fighting sleevels. This is also, if I wanted to do a jerkin, it would stop here without the sleeves. If I wanted to be fancy, I could make it so that the sleeves were completely finished on a separate piece and got tied into the sleeve sides rather than sewn in, so I could take them in and out. But I would need to make another piece to go underneath to do that, and it would either just be plain white or I would be recreating those sleeves. So if I want to do that in future, I can always unpick it and redo it. That's not a big issue. It won't be completely sealed with the lining. I'd be able to get to the sleeve still. So I'm just gonna sew them in, and if in the future I want to do that, I can. For now though, I just need to gather them up and get them in. This is starting to get somewhere.
At this point, my sewing machine kicked me in the butt as I went to put the sleeves in, and my gathering stitches snapped. So instead, I re-sewed them by hand using thicker thread, and that did the trick. I was able to set them in, gathering the head until they were fitted in. And then sew them in.
Okay, well these sleeves were a bit of a pain in the ass with the thread snapping and all, but they didn't go in with much difficulty. They were pretty easy to actually go in once they were pinned, so now it's starting to look like an actual jacket. Next job is to start closing up all of the seams. So I'm going to do the front facings first. I'm going to try and leave all the hand sewing. I'm trying to get all the machine sewing done, and I'll do the hand sewing later. So I'm going to be closing things up today, and then I will go in later and, for example, finish the inside of the sleeve side. I'm going to zigzag it now, but I will fold over the lining and do that later. And for example, obviously these need to be done. That is also a thing that I will get to. I think I need to cut them down just a little bit. So I will do that, and obviously buttons and things like that will be the very last thing I do. But progress has been made. Let's see if I can finish the machine sewing today. That is the plan. We'll see how it goes. So these are the facings that I've made up to match the front piece. So it's got the purple and the white stripe and then the green. Obviously I haven't done the stripes down because it's going to be, oh, it's a facing, so it's going to be under the chest. When I pressed it, I also went ahead and pressed in the fold for when I hand stitched this down. It's not exactly 150 centimeters. I did it by eye because it's going to be on the inside, and it's just a rough thing anyway, so that will just make my life easier when it comes to whip stitching that in. So all I need to do is pin this to the front and sew it in, and then that front seam is finished and ready to put buttons in once I've done the rest of the sewing.
But first, a quick ad break. Once I had the facing sewn on, I understitched it, which I'm not going to cover here, but I'll link to my video on it above and below. With that done, I could fold it down and whip stitch it into place.
Please excuse the mess, it has been a week, and the angle, I don't have any space to put it anywhere else. So, this has been going very slowly. I did actually hope to have this finished today, like I hoped to have it finished last week and the week before that. But stuff keeps happening. So I've been faffing around trying to figure out how to put the wings on, and in the end, in desperation, I did what I should have done a long time ago, and went back to the pattern. And of course in there, what you've all been screaming to me about says put the lining in last. I thought I was being smart, but actually I was just making things harder for myself. So the plan for today is to finish it, finally, hopefully, please. But before then, what I need to do is cry a little bit as I unstitch what I've already done. So I need to, I guess, about 5 centimeters off the bottom of here, so it's not actually that bad. Obviously then I also need to do where I've whip stitched it down and undo the tacking stitch that holds it together. But then I should be able to sew the wings in nice and easily in just one long thin line, and then whip stitch the lining down over the top once that's done. So I am hopeful. It is slowly but surely getting there. Maybe if I can have a day without any disturbance, then I might actually get this finished today. But yeah, now I get to sit here and unpick for a little bit, so enjoy that.
So while I do this unpicking, it feels like a good time to chat about the history of non-binary and gender non-conformists in history. It's always pretty difficult to assign a label to historical folks, as they just didn't have the same labels that we use today, and they had different pressures on them. There's a good handful of people who were assigned female at birth, who spent a long time living as a man in society, and there's a very good argument for some of them having lived that way to give themselves a chance to live outside of misogynistic expectations. Gender identity and sexuality have also been intertwined in a way that makes them very hard to unravel, such as groups like the Mollies in 18th and 19th century Britain. But we do have a long history of people dressing and living outside of their assigned gender, along with plenty of cultures having third or fourth gender categories. And that's before you even start to talk about intersex folk, people who are born outside of binary sexes. At this point, I should take a moment to point out that sex and gender are different. Sex is your body and the parts that you were born in, some of which can be changed through surgery, hormones and other medical intervention, and some of which can't. Sex is not a binary system. Biology is much more varied by that, but most people fit into the boxes that society has assigned to male or female. Gender, on the other hand, is what's in your head, how you feel, how you think, and how you see yourself. It's a lot more flexible and variable, and also not a binary system. And the roles and the norms that societies and cultures set around gender change regularly. So let's circle back to third and fourth genders. We have records of these going back as far as Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and there's a number of creation myths, including one from Mesopotamia, that involve people outside of the gender binary. Unfortunately, a lot of them were suppressed or outright criminalized in colonized nations, such as the Hijara of India, which means information can be hard to come by, and like all LGBT+ history, it's a little piecemeal. In some places they did and still do occupy a middle position between man and woman, and in other places they were and are considered outside of the binary entirely. It's a really fascinating subject that I could talk for hours on, but I've left a couple of places to start down below if you want to go down the rabbit hole. The point that I wanted to impress is that gender non-conformity isn't a new thing. Human history is full of people who stepped outside the gender binary and were even celebrated for it. The media might try and portray it as a new fashionable thing that people are being brainwashed or led into following, but what they actually mean is that the white West are finally getting names for something that is a piece of human history and biology, and people are finally finding names for aspects of themselves that always existed. With my unpicking done, I could move on to the wings. I did the same as I did for the sleeve wings and sewed an interlining in on the reverse side. This time I needed them to line up to the main body, which is why I waited this long to get them in. I could pin them to match the main stripes, and then do the rest by eye to account for the curve at the bottom of the doublet. And while I go through Stripe Hell Part 3, it's time for a short ad break. With the stripes on and sewn down, the wings were sewn together right sides facing, pressed and turned around, then tacked together at the top so they wouldn't slide around, before being sewn to the bottom hem of the doublet, right sides to right sides. Once that was done, I could repair my unpicking around the facings, and then fold the lining over the raw edge and whip stitch it into place, which I also did off camera for the lining of the sleeve side. Then I sewed many buttonholes down the front before running out of light.
Okay, yesterday I ended up having a fight with buttons, which meant that I ran out of time, but progress has still been made. The wings are on. I've started whipping the lining in. It's on this side. So this side is done, but I've left this side so I can show you guys on camera. And likewise, this sleeve is done, but I've left the other one so I can show you guys. So what I've got left to do before I can shoot this today is to sew buttons on, which I will talk to you guys about in a minute. Finish the other sleeve and that whip stitching, and then put the collar on. And then I can film it and get this video out, which will be great. So with the buttons, I wanted to make fabric buttons, but the fabric that I've got isn't working how I want them to, so I need to faff around with them and I don't have time to do that. I also am not happy with the machine sewn buttonholes. I want to do them properly. So for now it's going to be done with snaps and the buttons sewn on top of the buttonholes that I sewed yesterday that you guys have already seen. And that's what I've already done on the sleeve. So that's what we've got. It's my nice hastily painted button because I don't have any buttons that match because I was planning on doing fabric buttons. So yeah, that was a whole thing yesterday and cost me a lot of time. But here we are, praying to the sewing gods that I can get this finished today. But yeah, sleeve first and then we will tackle that collar together. This is the sleeve. I brought this cute little bit of lace to go around the cuff because I really love that look. And this is the button that I hastily made up last night. I tried it with just the lace first, but it doesn't look as good. It's got this bit of a, can you see it? It's got this bit of a strip at the top, which does make it very convenient to machine sew on, which is what I did, but means that it looks a bit bare somehow. So what I did was did another strip of bias binding on the edge of the cuff, and then sewed it on the top, and then folded it over and under and whip stitched it in. So if we find the other sleeve, you can see that's where I'm up to. It's got the bias binding exactly the same as I did around the top of the front and back panel pieces. Then this is stitched on top and down the edge as well, so it gets held in place. And then I just need to fold it under like so and whip stitch it into place and put that popper on. So that's what we're going to do now.
The collar was treated in the same way as both sets of wings. I sewed an interlining piece in, making sure that the top stitching was on the underside. Then it was sewn right side to right side with the doublet. Before finally being folded over and whip stitched into place. And then finally, after what felt like forever, I could put on the full outfit and head out loud and proud and fully fabulous.
And that's it. I hope you guys enjoy this set as much as I do. It's really nice to have something finished for once and ready to go. Technically. Obviously there's still a couple of fixes that I want to do, including doing those buttons and the buttonholes properly. That is something that I will do when I get time, but probably won't film, so I might put it up on Instagram, we'll see. I'll probably do another photo shoot with it at some point anyway, so hopefully by then they'll be done. The pattern matching isn't perfect, but this is why I don't very often pattern match. It's definitely good enough for me. I had to cut out the fabric 2.5 times just to start off with, so by the time I started sewing I was already done with pattern matching. I think that's partly why this took so long. Between that and the stripes, I was done before I really started sewing. I definitely set myself a challenge and I didn't really have the mental space to cope with it, but the fact that I managed it anyway is absolutely amazing and I'm so happy with what I managed to do. So yes, it was totally worth it in the end for all the drama and for all the time it took, and I really love it. I'm really happy with it, and it's really nice to have something that I actually designed for once, because normally obviously as a cosplayer I'm just copying what's already on the screen. So to come up with a pattern and a way that I wanted something to look and then to see it in real life is so nice. So I said at the beginning of the video that I picked the genderqueer flag because it's personal to me, and unsurprisingly that's because I myself am genderqueer. I did say, after all, that I would get onto gender identity at the end of the last video. So, for me personally, I am male, I am a man, and I use he, him pronouns, although I'm also perfectly happy with they, them. But I've had a very complicated journey with gender. There have been times when I identified as and lived full-time as a woman, and there have also been times where I presented a lot more masculine than I do these days. The reason that I identify personally with genderqueer is because the social construct of male just doesn't suit me. I feel like a square peg in a round hole. So I am a man, but the way that I identify with and identify as male doesn't quite fit in with the social standard. I have experience outside of it that leave me seeing it in a different way to most people, and I have no issue blurring the lines of the social construct. It's complicated, but gender is complicated as soon as you step outside the binary of male and female. And it might well shift. It has done before, and I wouldn't be surprised if it does in the future. But for now, genderqueer suits me and fits me as well as anything can, so it's the way that I identify my own gender identity. My question for you today is, what's your pet subject? The subject that you could talk about for hours or just love to fall into research holes over. You heard a little bit of one of mine at the moment, but honestly I feel at the moment that I just keep finding new ones. It seems like everything that I research drags me down a rabbit hole, and I just don't want to come out of them. There's just too many interesting things out there in the world, and all of them, I want to look into all of them. Thank you for watching through to the end, and as always, a huge thank you to all of my lovely subscribers and all of my very generous coffee donators. If you enjoyed this or found it helpful, please think about giving me a like or subscribing if you're not already for more sewing and costume related content, or donating to my coffee if you're able. Stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you again soon. Bye! This is a loud car. How sweaty is my back? Time to test out via the mirror. By which I mean you.